This is my 1959 Studebaker. You're probably wondering how I got here. Well, let's go back a year. So there I was, scrolling as usual, when I noticed there was a trend going on where people were doing what is called a budget body swap. For anybody who doesn't know, a budget body swap is pretty much buying a more modern, nice car that has creature comforts and then chopping it up to where it's a bare rolling chassis. And then you go and find yourself a beautiful piece of history. And then you also chop it up and you're left with a hollow skin. And then you take that skin, you put it over your awesome chassis, and in theory, you have a really cool little hot rod. In theory. So after being inspired, I ended up finding this 1959 Studebaker Lark on Facebook Marketplace and got it for $420 and an old Impact. The car is pretty much what you would expect for the price, as it's pretty thrash, but all the body panels were there and all the glass was in good shape. And I didn't have to deal with pulling an engine or transmission out. That leads us to our more modern chassis, which is a 1994 Mercury Cougar that has low miles and was in a small accident that I got for $500, and it ran and drove great. So without hesitation, we pulled the car in and started cutting it up. I really thought that it was going to be possible to do this swap in a single weekend, and on the first day we made really quick progress cutting up the car. And we were making sure to label all the wires that we took off, as well as anything that we thought might be useful, we saved in its own pile. This whole process made a huge mess and used a ridiculous amount of blades and discs. But soon enough, we had it down to a bare chassis. With day one at an end and a bare chassis burnout completed, we moved on to the Studebaker shell, which in theory was going to be easier to cut, but a whole bunch of rusty bolts made it a bit trickier to get apart. Not to mention the absurd amount of spiders that were living in it. With quick work, we rigged up some janky stuff with the lift, and it was finally time to test fit the two cars. What I quickly found out was that it seemed like the trimming of both cars would never come to an end. I seriously spent another day trimming both cars just so that they would almost come together, and it was not perfect, to say the least. Eventually, I got them close enough to where I could finally figure out where else it was rubbing and where else I needed to cut. Which one of those places was the rear wheel wells, which I would have to move a couple inches back to account for the slightly different wheelbases. One of my biggest regrets during this project was not measuring a straight line when I was cutting them, because I eventually had to fix that. I welded in some really thick square tubing to give the body something to sit on and allow me to line things up, but I quickly discovered I had made a mistake.
I messed up. I measured everything perfectly, so everything's super level. Unfortunately, the body of the Studebaker is not level. So pretty much my issue here is, even though my bars are flat and level with the ground, the Studebaker is sitting like this. So my solution is going to be cutting all my welds off, which really sucks.
It did suck. After fixing my mistakes, the body was finally sitting where I needed it to be, and I started to weld the two together. I also added more square tubing to help strengthen the parts where the two cars meet. Then it was time to try and fit the front end, and of course, once again, I could not cut enough. Luckily, the Cougar had a very large space between the radiator and the engine, so shortening everything was going to be possible. This was also the moment I realized that I was not going to be able to keep the massive ABS pump and module, which would also add more work that I hadn't expected. After shortening everything a solid foot, I needed to make a new way to hold the radiator and condenser, so I used more of the square tubing to make a simple mount. Then it was time to handle the ABS delete, which involved running all new brake lines across the entire car. After feeling a little burnt out, I wanted to do something fun and found a set of wheels on Marketplace from a Ford Focus for $200 and put them on, which absolutely transformed the look of this car. It was also important for me to have the final wheels on the car so that I could weld the rear fenders back on in their final position, which became a bit annoying since earlier I decided to freehand cut the fenders as straight as a wave pool. Next on the list was to start filling in all the voids between the two cars, and I decided to start with the trunk since I thought it would be the easiest. I had bought a sheet of metal for about $100 and would use it to make all the filler pieces. To make templates, I would use what is essentially cardstock, which you can get for free at a local post office. I also relocated the gas tank to inside the trunk because that's the only way that gas would flow and would make sense. After the trunk was done, I continued on to the wheel wells and created lots of little filler pieces to make that work. I then had some leftover square tubing and decided to build a brace behind the rear seats since both cars had some form of one to help stiffen the chassis. Honestly guys, I'm a little tired of talking, so I'm just gonna let you guys watch this montage I made. The car was really starting to feel like it was coming together, so I decided that it was finally time to give it a name. But we simply call it the Cougar Baker. Get it? Because it's a Mercury Cougar on a Studebaker. Okay, anyways. Next up of attaching the chassis was in the door openings, so it got the same treatment as the rest of the car and got welded, seam sealed, as well as painted. I decided to start tackling the wiring next as it was an absolute mess. My goal was to get rid of all the wiring that was no longer going to be needed, which included all the ABS wiring, cruise control wiring, power window wiring, and airbag wiring, which turns out to be quite a bit of wiring. I also wanted to change out all the crusty old looms with new looms since I'm already going to be in there, you know, just to clean things up. The simplified wiring should hopefully make it easier to deal with and diagnose in the future as well. I also needed to relocate the battery to the trunk, so I ordered a cheap kit from Amazon and used a heavier gauge wire all the way to the back. The battery tray I used was also from Amazon. And honestly, if you're doing this, definitely go on Amazon because all this stuff is considerably cheaper and honestly feels kind of better quality than some of the stuff I've seen locally. I also tackled mounting the fuse box and the main relay, as well as running the loom for the wiring, so the front of the car was finally cleaned up. The next step was to take the front end back apart so that I could add filler pieces, seam seal, and paint them to help add some more rigidity to the chassis, as well as attempt to help with rust in the future. With the front end being very close to being finished, the only thing left was to make all the lighting work. I ordered these LED headlights online and made quick work of adapting the old harness to them, as well as boring out the Studebaker signal housings to be able to pop in the Cougar signal bulbs. With the front being done, I moved towards the back and pretty much did the same thing. Just bored out the original housing so that the new lights would just pop in and be easily serviceable. Then I went ahead and finished replacing the rest of the sheathing with this very nice sheathing I got off of Amazon, which cleaned things up pretty nicely. So with all that, we're back to where we started. This car has been sitting in this spot for over a year. I was burned out on it, and I have no idea how many hours I have into this project, but I do know we are going to put a whole lot more into it. Alright, so I'm just gonna start going at this thing because there's a lot to do. The first one and major thing holding me back from finishing the interior is putting the old dash and making it work. And from there, that's a lot of pieces that are outside of the car that could be inside of the car. So I think I'm gonna start with that and then go from there. There's a lot to do on this thing, but it's pretty cool. Look at this right here. These are dated 1999. A little crusty. Dang, a free Nestle King bar? Someone missed out, man. Bop, beep, bop, boom, bop. The more layers I uncovered from the dash, the more difficult I realized this would be to fit a dash that wasn't meant to be more than a decoration. My plan was to try and turn the old dash into more of a cover and hollow out anything it didn't need, then freshen it up and make it look a little bit better, but try to keep the patina. And once again, I was back to cutting more than I ever expected to. I also quickly found out that I had cut through the wiring harness in a section and added a bunch more work. I also wasn't super happy with how the instrument cluster had to fit, but I really didn't have any options unless I wanted to do all new gauges, which I didn't. I got a little tired of the interior after fixing the wiring I had cut through, so I decided to finish mounting up some of the last exterior pieces that were laying around. I did end up getting the hood fitment better than it looks, but I will have to shift around some of the body panels to make it perfect. I was also pretty happy that the guy I got the Studebaker from had brand new side skirts laying around for this thing, so I also ended up welding those on. I also made the Cougar trunk latch work with the Studebaker trunk, which was pretty cool. Next up was the power steering pump, which I was having problems with as it was cutting in and out, so I got a brand new one. And it was fairly self-explanatory to install. After tackling some of the easier tasks, I decided to get back to the interior, and I pretty much had to make everything from scratch. So I would make templates using cardstock, then transfer them to hardboard and cut them out. After test fitting and trimming, I would then wrap them with Mexican blankets because they're cheap and match the desert hot rod theme. Before doing the final install of the dash, I welded in one more reinforcement piece just to help tighten things up. I wanted to keep the ashtray pocket on the dash, but there wouldn't be room for the back end, so I just welded the face onto it. I ended up splitting the dash in half as well so that I could paint the upper half and attempt to polish the bottom half, as well as polish any other pieces I could find that still had paint on them. If you're curious about the radio, I'll leave a link in the description because it was only like 60 bucks and has wireless Apple CarPlay, and honestly works pretty great, so highly recommend it. At this point, things felt like they were going pretty smooth, but little did I know that they weren't. I had recorded this bit, but apparently my microphone was not working, which continues the theme of things going wrong with this project. Anyways, what I was trying to say was I was pretty bummed out about the glass because it's 1, hard to find, and 2, expensive where I could find it. The way it broke was I needed to cut out a bit more space for the rear speakers to fit, and I believe the heat from the sparks hitting the window caused it to shatter because I was being stupid careful to keep the angle grinder away from the glass itself. To make things worse, I went to go for a test drive, and for some reason, third gear decided to become another neutral. And I think I might be able to fix that without taking the transmission out, but it's just yet another thing that was bumming me out after putting a ridiculous amount of time into this car. And yeah, the cherry on top was that the signals and brake lights also stopped working. Luckily, I did stay late and diagnosed it to be a bad flasher relay, but I went and put an AutoZone flasher relay in, and it still didn't work, and it was driving me crazy because I thought the wiring was bad. Yeah, it turns out that the AutoZone flasher was just bad, and then I put the 1959 Napa flasher from the Studebaker in, and the signal started working as well as the brake lights. So yeah, crazy. Anyways, with being so bummed out, I was just like, you know what, let me just polish the car, and I think I'm done for a little while. I'll figure out the glass and then kind of just take a break from the thing. When I first started polishing, I was just hoping to make the car look a little better, but I was honestly really surprised at how the car was transforming. It started to feel like a different car the more good paint that was uncovered, and it kind of started bringing back a little bit of the spark of this project. I still wasn't super excited about spending $600 on a piece of glass that could have been avoided, and I wasn't ready to take the transmission pan off, but seeing the car after another huge leap of progress makes the project just seem worth it again.
Qu'est-ce que je vais te nommer? Je vais te nommer l'amour, l'amour tendre, l'amour qui chante doucement dans mon cœur, l'amour sans logique à la raison.
I just want to take a moment to thank anyone who has donated in the life of this channel. I always appreciate you guys greatly. For anyone who made it this far in the video, I want to thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed it. As always, guys, I hope to see you at the next one.